I remember being about 14 years old when my dad, for the very first time, had enough confidence to put me behind the wheel of a car for the very first time. And I remember he took me to an empty parking lot because the likelihood of me killing someone was significantly smaller there. And I remember I buckled myself in and I turned the engine and I slammed on the gas, and all I heard was a but the car didn't move. So I stood there and panicked just a little bit, and the second time I pushed on the gas just a little bit, and it still didn't work. Nothing happened. The engine revved, but the car didn't go. And at that point, I remember turning to my dad and saying, "Dad, what am I doing wrong?" My dad's response to me in that moment was, "Oh, this is one of them fancy kind of cars. You know, the kind that you got to put in drive before it'll go." And the 14-year-old me got the picture. In that moment, my dad was not trying to give me a lesson in different types of cars. You know, there are some cars that you don't have to put into drive before you actually can drive them, but this one you do. There are different kinds of cars, and so first you have to know which kind of car you're dealing with. That's not what he was doing at all. What my dad was doing was telling me something I should have already known, and he was making fun of me for missing it too. He was reminding me of what is true of all cars. There aren't different kinds of cars, you know, those that need to be put in drive and those that don't. No, they are all the same. All cars, in some form or another, need to be put in gear before they will actually drive. And that's what my dad meant when he sarcastically told the 14-year-old me, "Oh, this is one of them fancy cars you need to put in drive." And I feel like this is what Jesus is doing in Mark chapter 9, verses 28 and 29. Jesus' disciples had a little bit of trouble casting out an evil spirit from a boy. They should have been able to do this. They had done that sort of thing before in the past, but today they couldn't, and the boy's dad turns to Jesus. With what little faith this dad has, he trusts Christ with his son to do something for his son that the father can't do himself. Jesus casts out the spirit from the little boy, and in the same moment inspires faith in the Father. Now, after that, the disciples are like the 14-year-old me, turning to Jesus and saying, "Well, Jesus, how come we couldn't drive that spirit out?" And Jesus' response there seems rather simple. This kind can only come out by prayer. Now, when you hear a lot of pastors or theologians talk about that statement, they make it seem as if Jesus is giving the disciples a lesson in demonology. Oh, well, there are different kinds of demons. Some demons can be driven out with just the right incantation, but that demon that was in that boy is of a different species, and they're a little stronger and require a little more oomph, if you know what I mean. Don't worry, you didn't know any better, but the next time you see one of those, you'll know the difference. I just don't see it that way. I don't think that's what Jesus is doing. If that's true, Jesus seems to do a very strange about-face from what he had said earlier. Earlier in that same episode, he criticizes his disciples for being an unfaithful generation, but now he lets them off the hook because they don't know their demons. And at the same time, if that's what Jesus had intended, it turns Christianity into Hogwarts. And the disciples are nothing more than Harry Potter learning the right spells in order to perform the right exorcisms. I'm just not convinced that this is what Jesus is trying to give. I don't think it fits the rest of the story. Instead, when Jesus speaks to his disciples, I hear my dad speaking to the 14-year-old me. "Oh, this is one of those fancy demons. The kind that can only come out by prayer." He's not giving them a lesson in varieties of evil spirits. He's doubling down on his criticism of them as a faithless generation. Their failure in being able to help that boy had nothing to do with their unfamiliarity with different classes of demons, but it had everything to do with their misplaced faith. What was important to Jesus is a life of faith that is so connected to God that you truly put no limits on his power. It's a kind of faith that works itself out in a deep prayer life. The disciples should have known better. This story is about faith. And one of the surprising lessons that we take from this story is that your faith can have an impact on people who are unable to demonstrate faith for themselves. This little boy needed help, man. He was not going to bring himself to Jesus. And he was not going to pray for himself. He wasn't capable of demonstrating faith while his convulsing was throwing him into fire and into water. If that boy was going to have any hope, it was going to come from the faith of somebody else doing something for him that he couldn't do for himself, in this case being his father. But this is a reality that we see repeatedly in the pages of the Bible. God often responds by coming to the aid of some desperate person's need because somebody else had faith. Ruth, she did the same thing in the book that bears her name. Her mother-in-law Naomi was overcome with such intense grief at the loss of both her husband and her 2 sons that she was incapable of displaying any faith of her own. In comes Ruth, who displays faith on Naomi's behalf, and God took care of both of them. In Mark chapter 2, the same sort of thing happens. There we are introduced to a guy who's paralyzed. And I'm going to tell you this, if you are paralyzed from the neck down, you ain't getting yourself up to go and see Jesus. You need some help. And luckily for this guy, he's got 4 friends who do just that for him. And when they do, Mark says something that shocks us. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralyzed man, "Your sins are forgiven." This man's physical life and his spiritual life were changed as a result of someone else's faith. Mark 9 is not about demons. It's about faith. And it's about your faith. It's about you displaying even the smallest shred of faith that drives you to pray to God on someone else's behalf when they can't go to God themselves. When the disciples asked Jesus, how come we couldn't cast that spirit out? Jesus doesn't tell them anything that they don't already know. This kind only comes out by prayer. And not prayer as voodoo magic or Hogwarts sorcery, but prayer as evidence that your faith and your trust are in God above all others, both for yourself and on behalf of others. There's an old professor of mine, his name is D.A. Carson, and he sums this up in perhaps one of the greatest books on Christian suffering when he says this: "In the deepest suffering, many find it almost impossible to pray. Should not the rest of us intercede for them?"